Hey guys, thanks for checking out this clip of Anatomy of the Church and State. Be sure to catch the full episode on Rumble or ChristiansForLiberty.com. Links are in the show description. So, still hanging on by a thread here, but I think it's safe to say we've seen some pretty disastrous moral results of the result of the separation of church and state. To this day, with just the absolute evil stuff that's just like right in our face now. It's not even being hidden. Why do you think the church remains afraid? You mentioned earlier that they're afraid to say anything. Why do you think they remain that way?
One
In
of
your
the
opinion?
reasons, yeah, no, I mean, I can't give someone else's opinion, but I think one of the reasons um, why the church is struggling is because they don't know her history. If you knew how many similar times we've been pushed to this same wall, and how it was the men of courage who stood up and said no, and got up in front of their congregations day in and day out and said, "This is truth, and this is what is real, and this is what's not, and this is what Scripture says, and this is what it doesn't say," and they did that with love. They did that with passion, and they showed their love by their passion. When you've seen how often that's happened before, you suddenly go, this is normal. This is what we expect Christians to live like. This idea that we are supposed to cave and compromise is false. On our show, Revive Thoughts, we take the best pastors from the best preachers in history. The best pastors and best preachers in history are not compromisers. They're all firm in the faith. You're not going to find people who kowtowed and rolled around and who are remembered 100 years later, whose sermons are worth reading through. They just aren't the ones who God keeps around. It's the guys who drew the lines in the sand and said, "Here I stand, I can do no other," right? Those are the ones that we bother to remember. A great example is Charles Spurgeon, who is the Baptist preacher in London. When he was preaching there, he was the preacher over the largest Baptist church in England, which is obviously when England was at the height of her empire under Queen Victoria. And at the end of his life, he went through what was called the downgrade controversy, which is where his journal, his magazine, had published this thing basically using, by the way, church history. And they said, if we're not careful, Christian institutions will begin to quit being Christian over time. And if they don't revive themselves in Christianity, new institutions will have to replace those old institutions because they can't be relied upon. They used examples through church history, like how these things were founded in Christianity are no longer Christian to us today. And I mean, we see that too, right? Yale, Harvard, Princeton, all of those names were once Christian universities and Christian seminaries, and yet you would not imagine Christians coming out of those places anymore. And so we can see it with our eyes. His journal published that, and they attacked him like crazy. They said, "What are you doing?" No, we're not downgrading our faith. We're evolving our faith to match the times. And Spurgeon firmly wrote letters and articles defending what they had said, saying, "No, we're right on this. Scripture says we don't need to upgrade the faith. We don't need to, mix in these scientific nonsense ideas into our faith. We don't need to say that the Bible is errant and we're all doing the best. All these ideas that you're adding to the faith are wrong, and you're proving our point." Eventually, it got to his denomination, and they had a vote on it. They said, "Well, who's right, Charles Spurgeon or the denomination that he's been with for 30, 40, not 40 years, but for many years, and he had helped make famous in London?" And they voted him down 2000-7. He lost that vote handedly.
Wow.
And the denomination straight up said, "We're against you on this, Spurgeon. We don't think that things are getting liberal. And even if they are, we think it's good." Which is kind of a classic liberal argument. It's not happening. If it were, it would be a good thing anyway. And Spurgeon said, "Okay,
Right.
we're going to have to agree to disagree on this. I'm leaving the denomination because we're not on the same page on this." So he left. Everyone was like, "Spurgeon, what are you doing? If you lost your mind, you're a fool. You become too proud. You become too arrogant. You think you're the only one. Just because you're the biggest church doesn't mean." And they slammed him and slammed him and slammed him in the papers and everywhere else till the last of his days. His wife specifically said that, Spurgeon never had the best health, but this controversy just broke what was left of his health. And he died in his early 50s, I believe. And his wife said it was this that broke him. He had so many friends whose, churches he had preached at, who preached at his churches. He'd gone to their weddings. He'd had all these relationships, and all of them just collapsing, and all the pressure on him all at once to compromise just broke him. But to his dying days, he said, "Look, I'm right." And he even said, history is going to be on my side on this. You think that you're winning, but you're wrong. And if history doesn't vindicate me, God will. Well, history
Well,
absolutely vindicated him. He was dead right. The theological liberalism, the attack on the Bible was wrong. These guys were drifting us away from the faith, and that many of the great Christian institutions at that time had already been infiltrated by the progressives of their day. And that it was already in the mix. The end was already in time. And when the fundamentalists came around and when the Christians who were sincere about their faith showed up, they looked back and said, has anybody been sounding the alarm on this? Are we the only ones who see what's happening? And lo and behold, the first person they saw was there was a guy named Charles Spurgeon, who I believe died in, it was either 89 or 93, but about a decade before, it was really aware. He was saying, this is what's happening. And so he was ahead of the curve by probably about 15 to 20 years. He called and prophetically saw, and I don't mean in the sense of like a vision from God, but just using his resources. Yeah. He said, this is where we're going. And when people like B.B. Warfield and J. Gresham Machen and many others started their movement, they were able to join him in that, but they were only doing what he had already done before. We might be living in that era right now. You might be in your environment. You might be a Charles Spurgeon where you're 15 to 20 years ahead and you're ringing a bell and no one's listening. You're saying, hey, this cultural rot is bad. You're not the first person to have gone through this. Maybe you'll have your Martin Luther moment and everyone around you will agree with you. But if not, you're in the Charles Spurgeon camp getting voted down. Know that it's gone through it before, and history is going to vindicate you, and God is going to vindicate you as well. And there are other people watching. Spurgeon rang this alarm bell, but the people around him didn't see it. But the people who did were the younger ones. And when they saw somebody standing up 10 years later, when they're asking themselves, what's wrong with the church today? They looked back at him and not the people that were famous at that time. Not, I can name some of the names, but not the people who had gone along with the current. A lot of their reputations are not as known today because they didn't stand up in that time.
So it's safe to say that the character arc we're on right now is not unique.